And the book of Hebrews is a challenging book, and it begins with such a high point. God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become so much better than the angels, as he has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. Whoa. You talk about a paragraph, theologians would call that Christology, the doctrine of Christ. That's easily a 3-month series just from these 4 verses about Christ. From the prophets to Christ, from creation in the past to upholding all things in the present, to Christ risen and exalted at God's right hand. But the hook that I want us to use over these next few weeks for our series this Christmas season is God has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. The question is, what did God say when he spoke to us by his Son? And so over the next few weeks, not exactly sure how many yet, but I don't think it'll be 2.5 years like Proverbs, but over the next few weeks, we're going to look at what God was saying to us at Christmas. You could call them God's Christmas statements. And today is statement number 1. I am in control. Now look at this. In various times and in various ways, God in times past spoke to us by the prophets. I have this passage memorized in the King James, and it's one of those great King James verses. God who at sundry times and in divers manners. Huh? In various ways, at various times, God spoke to us in the past through the prophets. And you can go through the Old Testament and see many different ways and many different times where God used his prophets to either speak or put out an object lesson or demonstrate by their lives what God was saying. But now he has spoken to us by his Son. What you may not realize is that between in times past and in these last days is 400 years. There is a gap of 400 years between the end of Malachi and the appearance of John the Baptist in the book of Matthew. If you just read through the Bible, you kind of think, well, Malachi put down his quill, and a couple weeks later, Matthew picked up his, and the story kept going. Not so. There is this period between the Old and New Testaments. Scholars got real fancy and called it the intertestamental period. It's the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It is often called the silent years because these 400 years between the end of Malachi and John the Baptist appearing on the scene in Matthew, these 400 years, seems to be no revelation from God. There's no prophets writing books. There's no visions being recorded. It appears that they really are silent years, that nothing's happening between Malachi and Matthew. But we, over 2,000 years later, looking back, know that even though they were apparently silent years, God was working. He was working, and the first statement that he makes this Christmas time is, even when I'm silent, I am in control. Whether you can see it or not, whether it seems like it or not, I am at work and I am in control. And that led me, Galatians also has some great Christmas verses in it. Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. God is in control, and at the right time, he sent his son. Now, here's your Greek language lesson for the day. In the Greek language, there are two words for time. There's the word kairos, which means an opportunity that comes your way. It's kind of like, I wasn't expecting this, and all of a sudden it's here, and I'm going to grab that opportunity. And then there's the word chronos. That's the word from which we get our word chronology. And it means an orderly progression of things where everything is falling into place and is following the proper sequence, and everything is working as it's supposed to. That's the word in Galatians 4. In the fullness of chronos, when the time was right, when the orderly progression of things, through those 400 silent years, things were progressing. And in the orderly progression of things, in the fullness of chronos, God sent his son. So I want us to, this is not the sermon yet, okay? This is just the setup. I want us to look at how God was working, how the chronology was working in those 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. I'm going to take you back to whenever you studied the history of civilization or the history of the world. In these 400 years, to the fullness of time, it was the proper time culturally for Christ to come. Because between Malachi and Matthew, there was a guy named Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquered the world. And if you remember your history of the world, this was the Greek Empire. This was the dominant force at that time. He was the man, you may recall, that at age 33 he died. The story is he died in tears because there were no more worlds for him to conquer. And he brought in the Greek Empire. With him came the Greek culture, the Greek philosophy, but most importantly, the Greek language. The Greek language was the most precise, most descriptive of all of the ancient languages. And it was still the language at the first century. Regardless of where you were born, and regardless of what your native language was, you learned Greek. Because if you were going to do commerce across national lines, you had to be able to speak the same language. And so everybody in the world at that time, no matter what their birth language was, knew Greek. It was the language of the common people. It was a universal language, so that when it came time to spread the gospel, the disciples didn't have to learn 15 different languages to go to 15 different areas. Everybody spoke Greek. It was the language of commerce. It was the language that unified the world at that time. It took on added significance because in 280 BC, the Old Testament that had been written in Hebrew was translated for the first time into Greek. And if you ever do studies of the Bible and you come across a word that looks like Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So you can see that the stage is set. Everybody's speaking one language. Now everybody doesn't have to learn Hebrew to study the prophets or the Old Testament because they're in Greek for them. The time is right, so that people could more easily travel from nation to nation and be accepted. It was the right time, the fullness of time culturally. But it was also the right time politically. Alexander the Great died at 33. And as he lay on his deathbed, his four main generals, he had divided his empire among those four generals to kind of oversee things. They gathered around him on his deathbed to see which of them he would designate to be his successor. And they asked him who he was going to leave the empire to. And he said, as he lay dying, I bequeath all of my holdings to the strongest. He dies, war breaks out between those four generals, each of them trying to conquer the other territories. And during the century before Christ was born, the Greek Empire basically falls apart, and from the ashes comes the Roman Empire. And in the century before Christ is born, the Romans took control of all of those sections that Alexander had conquered. The Greek culture brought language and philosophy. The Roman control brought roads, because they wanted to make sure that commerce could flow freely. The Roman Empire, in the years before Christ, built what basically was the first interstate system. They actually had semi-paved roads from all of the major port cities so that commerce could flow. With Roman law came Roman protection. If you were a Roman citizen, you were protected by Rome. You may remember at one point when Paul is threatened, he says, oh, by the way, I'm a Roman citizen, because that afforded him Roman protection. For the first time, it was safe to travel the seas and to travel the roads. In your study, you may remember some, isn't it weird how things kind of stick somewhere in your brain, somewhere, and you say, why did I remember that? But there was a thing I remembered from this study called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And because of the might of Rome, it was safe to travel the Mediterranean Sea. It was safe to travel the roads. And so the gospel could spread freely because of the Roman Empire. And so politically and culturally, it's the fullness of time. Everything is in place. Those 400 years seem to be silent, but God is saying, oh no, I'm working behind the scenes. I am in control. I'm setting the stage. Because then a Roman by the name of Octavius comes to power. He is so impressive that the Roman Senate decided to make him their ruler. They did not like the word king. It had some negative connotation to them. So they chose the word Augustus, the August one. And that's where Caesar Augustus comes from. And in the fullness of time, in those days, you remember how Luke starts. In those days, Luke chapter 2, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. All Caesar knew was he wanted a census so that he could tax people. His tribe remains among us today. But all he knew was he wanted to get some taxation. Little did he know that when he called for that census, he was in fact setting God's plan into faster motion. Several years ago, I was in a conversation that I end up in from time to time with people who want to discuss religious things, and they said, I know the Christmas story about Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem, but why were they going to Bethlehem? And I realized after a minute or two that that person was serious. They did not know the story well enough to know why Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem. We know why. Luke 2 tells us that Caesar Augustus, the August one, decided to make a census so that he could tax the world. And his decree was you had to go to the town of your lineage to register for the tax. Joseph is from the tribe of David. David's city is Bethlehem Ephratah. Now, the reason Bethlehem Ephratah is important is because there's another Bethlehem. And God wanted to make sure we knew which one he was talking about when he inspired the prophet Micah in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, hundreds of years before this, to say that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem Ephratah. So, in other words, the surface reason why Mary and Joseph are traveling to Bethlehem is to register for the census. But the real reason is the Messiah has to be born in Bethlehem Ephratah. And God has to get a pregnant Mary to Bethlehem Ephratah just as she's to give birth so that the prophecy can be fulfilled. God is in control. And he uses a heathen nation and a heathen dictator and an odious burden of taxes to get Mary and Joseph out of Nazareth down to Bethlehem Ephratah so that the Messiah could be born as the prophet had foretold hundreds of years before. Now just think about this. If the decree from Caesar had been 3 months earlier, the prophecy would not have been fulfilled. If it had been 6 months later, the prophecies would not have been fulfilled. But in the fullness of the chronology, in the fullness of time, when the time was right, exactly at the right moment, when there's a universal language, where there's peace in the world through Roman control, God, whose clock keeps perfect time and whose calendar keeps perfect time, allows to be put into motion a series of events that leads to Jesus the Messiah being born in Bethlehem Ephratah. You ought to get a little bit excited about that. God is in control. And he's setting the stage through that 400 so-called silent years of the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire to get everything ready. Daniel chapter 2, verse 21. God changes times and seasons. And the psalmist said in Psalm 31:15, my times are in your hands. There are many days when things happen and I wonder why. The older I get and the longer of a history I have with God, the more I realize that as long as I'm staying obedient to him, I really don't need to worry myself about why things happened the way they did. I just have to trust him that they did and that he knows why. I ran across an interesting post on social media last night. A Christian young man was talking about someone who he knew who was older in the Lord and an older man. And he said, we had both gone through just shattering times simultaneously. And he handled it a whole lot better than I did. And I said to him, the older, more experienced Christian, I said to him, it seems like you have more faith than I do. And he said to me, no, I don't have more faith than you do. I have more experience with the faithfulness of God. Oh, yeah, that's it, isn't it? God's track record. As you have experience with the faithfulness of God, you understand he is in control. So all of the things that have you frustrated, all of the things that have you shaken, please listen to this Christmas statement. God has spoken to us by his Son, and what he says is, I am in control. Now I'm going to start preaching to you. Because it's hard to wait, isn't it? Israel's waited 400 years to hear something new from God. I don't know how long you've been waiting on an answer, but there's some things we should remember while we're waiting. And this is just a synopsis of the story I just told you. First, God has a plan. You need to know that. God has a plan. I love the song, Jesus, You're My Firm Foundation. There's a part of that song that says, God has a plan for me, of this I am sure. And if you know that God has a plan for you, you can handle the bumps along the way. His plan 2,000 years ago was to get a pregnant Mary to Bethlehem Ephratah to fulfill Micah 5:2. And it took him 400 years to get everything in place, to get all the chronology lined up. He was silent, but boy, was he working. He has a plan. And I know that Jeremiah 29:11 has been run into the ground, but hear it one more time. God says, I know the plans that I have for you to give you hope and a future. God has a plan. The challenge for us is we don't know what all it involves because he rarely tells us what's going on. He just wants us to trust and obey. I've told you before that as I've gotten older, it seems like my imagination is kind of getting out of control sometimes. But I've been trying to imagine this trip with Mary and Joseph on the back of a donkey going from Nazareth to Bethlehem. I don't know how long that trip took, but Donna has been pregnant 3 times, and we have taken trips during those pregnancies. And I do know this: the trip from Nazareth to Bethlehem takes a whole lot longer with a 9-month pregnant lady than it does otherwise. Because, you got to stop every 15 minutes or so. And so, but see, again, God keeps perfect time, and he figured all that in. He said, well, we need the decree to come out just about now, so they'll get here then, so that she'll go into labor once they get there. God's in control. And I wondered, and my imagination said, I wonder, because we know that both Mary and Joseph were devout, I wonder if on their way something clicked. And I wonder if Mary looked at Joseph or Joseph looked at Mary and said, wait a minute, where are we going? We're going to Bethlehem Ephratah. Didn't Micah say something about that? Oh, every once in a while you're in the middle of God fulfilling something and it dawns on you, I'm in the middle of God fulfilling something. But most of the time, he doesn't let us in on that. And we just have to understand that we may not know everything that's involved in God's plan. We don't have to. We've got the track record with him that he knows what he's doing and he has a plan and he's working behind the scenes to accomplish it. Now, we can debate the theological implications of this. But again, I saw something a couple of weeks ago that said, I asked God, why are you so quiet when I'm going through these struggles? And God said to me, don't you know the teacher is always quiet during the test? I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting. You'll hit it on the way home, you go, But we aren't always going to know what God's plan is, but we can know that he's working behind the scenes. That's Christmas statement number 1. I am in control. I am working behind the scenes to accomplish my plan for you. See, if it had not been for the collapse of the Greek Empire and the rise of the Roman Empire and Caesar Augustus coming to power, there would have been no edict that would have required Mary and Joseph to take that trip to Bethlehem. But God is working behind the scenes to set things up. And when the time is right, you'll see the fulfillment. Our problem is we just hadn't got to the fullness of time yet. When the time is right, we'll see the fulfillment, but not until the time is right. When the angel appeared to Joseph and said, don't be afraid to go ahead with the engagement to Mary, because that holy thing in her is the Son of God. But the angel did not say, oh, and by the way, in about 8.5 months, you're going to have to go down to Bethlehem, and that's okay because that's the prophecy. He didn't tell him that. But when the time was right, in the fullness of time, God sent his Son. I heard somebody, this sounds an awful lot like Robert Schuller. I don't know, but it's pretty spot on. When it's not right, God says no. When the time's not right, God says slow. When you're not right, God says grow. When everything's right, God says go. Kind of like that. And in the fullness of time, when everything was right, God woke Caesar Augustus up in the middle of the night and said, you ought to make a rule that everybody has to go to the town of their lineage to register for a census. Now, we can know all of these things, but how do we put it into practice in our own personal lives? How can we keep going while we're waiting? I will tell you from my experience in hospitals that other than the morgue, and sometimes honestly more than the morgue, the most challenging room in the hospital is a waiting room. The waiting room outside of open heart recovery, the waiting room outside of ICU, the waiting room. When there's nothing to do but wait. That is so hard. And it's hard to do in life, isn't it? To wait, to feel like somebody's pushed pause in your life and you're not quite sure what's next. Well, how do you keep going while you're waiting? I'm so glad that God included in Luke chapter 2 the story of Simeon. Luke chapter 2 verse 25 tells us that he was just and devout. And this old saying of God teaches us how to keep going while we're waiting. Luke chapter 2 verse 26. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. So he came by the Spirit into the temple. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him according to the custom of the law, he took him up in his arms and blessed God. How do you keep going? It's one thing to know, yes, I know God has a plan, and I know he's not going to share all the details with me, and I know he's working behind the scenes, and I know that when the time is right, but I'm going nuts right now. How do I have any kind of peace while I'm waiting on all this to happen? Simeon shows us. First, get a promise from God. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die until he had seen the Messiah. He got a promise. And I would imagine that there were days, we don't know for sure how old he was, but he was an old man. And I'm sure that there were days when he woke up thinking, man, I'm just about to die. And then he said, oh, no, I'm not. I haven't seen the Messiah yet. God promised me I'm not going to die till I get to see the Messiah. When you're going through a difficult time, it is appropriate to ask God to give you a promise. Sometimes he just does. Sometimes you're going through a challenge and God just drops a verse into your spirit and says, this is for you, hang on to it. But sometimes it doesn't seem like the promise is there. It's okay to say, God, would you please give me something to hold on to? Would you please give me a promise to get me through this? It had been revealed by the Holy Spirit. He wasn't going to die till he saw the Messiah. Get a promise. Ask for a promise from God. God, give me something to hang on to while I'm waiting. But while you're waiting, you have to be faithful. And that's where the challenge is, to be faithful in the waiting room. Verse 25 says that he was waiting for the consolation of Israel, the Messiah. And that word waiting is a fascinating word. It means to look with the purpose of finding something. Have you ever been maybe like at a big airport or something and somebody's landing and you're supposed to pick them up? And you know what it's like to look through the crowd with the purpose of looking for that purpose, that person? That's the word that's used here. Simeon wasn't just saying, oh, what an interesting group of people here. He was looking for the Messiah. And I kind of think that every day at the temple gate, he's looking at every young couple that comes in. Because the young couples had to bring their children to the temple to fulfill the law regarding a young baby. And so he knew that's where the Messiah ultimately was going to show up. And so he's there. And every day, every time he sees a young couple come in with a babe in their arms, he's looking. Is this the Messiah? Is this the Messiah? And I told you about my imagination. My imagination thinks that, there were rotating groups of priests that served in the temple. And I imagine a new group coming in. And one of them noticing day after day after day after day, there's this same old man at the temple gate. And he finally goes to somebody who'd been there a while and he said, what's with the old man at the gate? He's kind of spooky. He'd been there every day. He just looks at every couple coming in. What is this? And the guy that'd been there a while said, oh, that's Simeon. Simeon claims that God has told him he's not going to die till he sees the Messiah. So he's here waiting to see the Messiah. And he's just going to be here every day till the Messiah gets here. He is faithful in the waiting room. And part of that faithfulness is being where you're supposed to be while you're waiting. I was thinking about this a day or two ago, and it hit me that there have been times in my life where if God had given me a promise like that, I would have said, okay, God, I understand I'm not going to die until I see the Messiah. I'm going home to my recliner. And when the Messiah shows up, you can drop by my house and I can see him, right? I don't make me make the effort to go stand at the temple all day long for who knows how long. I'm going home comfortable. You just bring the Messiah by. Now that sounds sacrilegious, but that's the way a lot of us treat God. God, when you get around to it, this is where I'm going to be. Not Simeon. He was where he needed to be because he knew that every baby, remember at 8 days old, had to go to the temple. And so he's going to be at the temple because eventually, whenever that Messiah is born, in 8 days, he's going to be there. And he's where God wanted him to be. See, while you're waiting, the tendency is to get lazy or to get complacent or to just kind of drift away. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 17, when there's a famine in the land, and God said, go to the Kerith ravine. I have ordered the ravens to feed you there. Now, if Elijah had said, I don't like the Kerith ravine, I'd rather go over here somewhere, Elijah would have starved to death, and there'd have been a bunch of ravens questioning God, why do we keep dropping food over here at Kerith ravine? Ain't nobody there. But if you're where God wants you to be, you'll see the fulfillment. Now, God is not playing tricks with you. He's not going to hide it. He's going to, you know where you need to be. You know what you need to be doing. And as you do what you know you need to be doing while you're waiting, you're being faithful in the waiting room and never give up on God's promise. We talk about Abraham waiting 20 years for the promise. We think about Joseph waiting 13 years. We think about Moses waiting 40 years. The children of Israel waited 400 for the promise to be fulfilled. And we don't know how long Simeon had been at the temple because the Bible doesn't tell us when God gave him that promise. It just says he did. But every day he stands at the temple gate, carefully watching every couple. Is this the Messiah? Is this the Messiah? And one day, Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus walk up. And something happens inside Simeon. Because you remember when Mary, who's just pregnant, goes to see Elizabeth, who's pregnant with John the Baptist leaps in her womb. So, I've got this sense that something happened inside Simeon, and God said, here he is. And again, my imagination, this old man, maybe struggling to walk, feeble, walks up to Joseph and Mary. May I hold him? And he lifts him up in his arms and blesses God. God is in control. And while you're waiting, keep holding on to the promise. Keep faithful. Be where you're supposed to be. Do what you know you're supposed to do. And never give up on the promise. God has spoken to us by his Son. And statement number 1 is, I am in control. Father, let that get hold of us. Because a lot of times we wonder, and a lot of times doubts rise up. But may we be aware that you are at work. Even when it's silent, doesn't mean you're not working. And Lord, help us. Every time we see a nativity scene, every time we hear a Christmas carol this month, remind us that God has spoken to us by his Son. I am in control. And Lord, I think probably most of us in this room need that word today, because there are things going on in our lives that are more than we can handle by ourselves. So assure us that you are in control. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine on you and give you his peace now and evermore. Amen. God bless you. Thanks for coming out today. And word number 2 is, I am with you. So hang on to that one for next week.